Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
One of the greatest shows on Earth has been going on now for several months in Hawaii, where the Kilauea volcano at Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park has been erupting since late December. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. The Kilauea volcano is the most active volcano on Earth. It's also a relatively safe volcano in that it spends most of its time simmering and bubbling without any spectacularly explosive eruptions. But lately, it has been putting on some incredible shows of lava fountains, with one glowing string of magma soaring about 1,000 feet in the air, a truly spectacular sight to see. To understand what's going on with Kilauea and what danger it poses, if any, we're joined today by Matt Patrick, a research geologist with the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. We'll be back in a minute with Matt.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Hi, Matt. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
It's been an exciting time out there at Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park in recent weeks. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but you're a research geologist with the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, right?
Yep. So my job involves, I work at the Volcano Observatory, and I'm in the geology team. So my job entails going out to the field and monitoring the eruptions and monitoring the flows, the lava lakes, the lava fountains. So, in the time I've been here, there's been a lot of activity. So, things are always changing. So it's a very interesting job.
Yeah, I bet. I bet you there's a lot of competition to get a job there.
That's a good question. I think for many volcanologists working at or folks who go into volcanology, are in grad school, I know it was for me and other students I talked to, working at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory is definitely a dream job because, well, it is special among the volcano observatories of the world because we get so up close with activity. Most of the activity is relatively safe in the sense that you can approach it, at a close distance, which is, of course, exhilarating, but it also really helps you collect the best data. Now, if you compare that to other volcanic areas where they have more explosive activity, and at those volcanoes, you really need to keep a safe distance, stay much farther away. So the fact that we have this, if what's called effusive activity, lava flows, lava lakes, means that you can approach and, get up close and personal with it.
Yeah. So is it better than, say, the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory?
It's very different. Just because, that observatory, it's a big caldera, so its eruptions happen very rarely over, hundreds of thousands of years. Big caldera systems like that can have small scale explosive activity, more frequently. But thankfully, Yellowstone is, pretty quiet. they had a little bit of a small kind of steam blast eruption. I don't know, you probably saw that in the news recently, last year.
Right. Yeah, we covered that.
Yeah, so activity like that is pretty common, or it can happen at caldera systems, just because there's a big reservoir of magma beneath the surface and a lot of heat, and water can trickle in and create these steam blast explosions. But that's obviously more sporadic. Kilauea, which is the volcano that we one of the main volcanoes that we monitor here at Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. It's one of the most active volcanoes on Earth, so it erupts very frequently. So there's always, well, not always, but very frequently eruptions, and ones that we can, monitor very closely, get a closer view of, and really collect really high quality data.
Yeah, yeah. Now, as you've mentioned several times, it's a relatively safe volcano. I think there's 5 different types of volcanoes, and the ones there at Hawai'i Volcanoes are shield volcanoes, right? Or shield volcanoes.
Yeah, shield volcanoes. They're basaltic, so it's a very fluid lava. It's pretty runny, and so it kind of just stacks up and flows and makes a kind of a broad shield. And I should say it's safe most of the time, in terms of personal safety. But these lava flows can really wreak havoc on the surrounding communities when they flow into residential areas. And that's what happened in 2018,
right,
and many other times previously. But in 2018, we had a very large eruption on the lower flank of Kilauea, and it destroyed 700 homes.
Right. Yeah, pretty unusual for Kilauea, at least. I guess one of the other problems or human concerns is Pele's hair. My youngest son lives out in the Big Island with his wife there, and they were up at the park, I guess, observing the eruption the other day, and he actually said he had a mask on because of Pele's hair.
Yeah, Pele's hair. So whenever you have lava fountaining, it's going to produce huge amounts of Pele's hair, which is basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. It looks exactly like hair. It's basically spun out pieces of volcanic glass. So another way to look at it is kind of like fiberglass, which is not something that obviously you want to breathe in, or not something you really want to touch with bare hands. But huge amounts of the Pele's hair is being produced by lava fountains. And really the thing that determines its impact is just the wind. It can be carried for miles and miles. So it really just depends on what way the winds are blowing. And with this latest lava fountaining episode we had a couple days ago, we had very slack winds. So the plume was kind of rising vertically, and a lot of that Pele's hair was falling out in the popular areas of the national park. I went up yesterday, and the vehicle that I was using to go out in the field was just kind of covered in it. And so that was a little unusual, because normally the trade winds here blow towards the southwest, and that is towards the Ka'u Desert, which is uninhabited. So that's obviously a more suitable place for Pele's hair to fall out. So it really just depends on the wind. And what people do here, I live in Volcano Village, which is just several miles from the summit and the caldera. We're all on water catchment. So many of us, if we know that there's Pele's hair falling, we just have to detach the gutters from the catchment system to avoid getting Pele's hair in the water tank.
Interesting. All the little secrets you learn about living in different places of the world. When did this eruption start? Kilauea is one of the most active, or the most active volcano in the world, and it kind of goes through these eruptive phases from time to time. When did the current eruption start?
The current eruption started December 23rd of 2024, and it hasn't been a steady, continuous eruption. It's been operating in these very distinct episodes. And recently, most of the episodes have been lasting maybe a half a day or a day, and then there's a week or so between the fountains. So, what happens is we can see with our instruments, like the tilt meters, which basically measure the pressure of the magma reservoir beneath the summit, or the magma chamber. We can see that pressure is building between these episodes, and it reaches a critical point where basically the conduit opens and the lava starts erupting, and it begins very abruptly. It's kind of like opening a valve, and that fountain can go from 0 to, well, 200, 300 meters in a matter of tens of minutes. So the fountaining lasts for, a number of hours. It's all contained within the summit caldera. So there's thankfully no threat to residential areas. The main hazards are volcanic gas and Pele's hair, like we talked about earlier. But these fountains, they'll operate for several hours, and then they also they feed these channelized lava flows that spill out onto the caldera floor and basically build up that crater floor.
Yeah. Now, why you separate them in episodes, and how do you know when an episode begins or ends, or an eruption? I'm sure you know when an eruption begins, but how do you know when it ends and it's just not a long pause between episodes?
Yeah, it's very clear and very distinct. Basically, between these episodes, there's very little. There is maybe some degassing from the vents. So there's kind of a faint plume that's rising up. We measure the gas emissions, and they're relatively low to moderate. But once we start to see, we can start to see volcanic tremor kind of building up. And very abruptly, lava starts kind of bubbling out of the vent. And that's a sign that, the episode is starting. And within tens of minutes, that bubbling and spattering can then build up to a real serious lava fountain. So it's very abrupt and very distinct. Yeah. These episodes end as abruptly as they start, which is also very interesting. So the fountaining will be going on, very vigorously, and then in a matter of tens of minutes, it just shuts down. So it is very much like the volcanic conduit is acting like a valve, just kind of opening and closing. And that's, basically, feeding magma from the reservoir up to the surface when it's open, and then it's shut off, and that stops.
So how do you know when you've had the last episode of an eruption?
That's a good question. We're looking at that now because after the last episode, what we've noticed is that the volcanic tremor has dropped below a level where it normally was between these episodes. So that might be a sign that things are dying out, but we don't know yet.
Yeah.
So each episode has been a little bit different. What we see now in this quiet interval is a bit unusual compared to the other intereruptive periods.
Yeah. Now, Kilauea has been studied for well over 100 years because of its.
Oh yeah, our observatory started in 1912, and we had our 100-year anniversary 10 years ago. So yeah, we've been operating for a while. It was started in 1912 by a guy named Thomas Jagger, who had visited Mont Pelée after the 1902 eruption. This is in the Caribbean, where something like 29,000 people were killed. And his motivation was he recognized that the previous approach to studying volcanic eruptions was flawed in the sense that people would always show up after an eruption and try to figure out what happened. What he wanted was to go to a place that had consistent activity so that you could watch things in action, during the course of events. And Hawaii at that time had this lava lake that had been operating for 100 years. So it was an ideal location for that. So yeah, the observatory started in 1912, and we've been running ever since.
And yet, despite that century of monitoring, there are still many, many unanswered questions of the functions, what's going on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're fundamentally limited because our instruments are on the surface, right? We have seismometers, we have GPS instruments that are bolted into the ground, but and we're trying to deduce or infer what that magma chamber beneath the surface is doing. But we don't obviously have direct measurements of the chamber and what's going on and how the magma is evolving. So yeah, we're fundamentally limited in that sense. If you study the weather, you can send up a weather balloon or fly a plane through a cloud and get direct measurements of the weather and the atmosphere. But we can't do that with a magma chamber.
Well, do you know how large the magma chamber is there at Kilauea? Because I know at Yellowstone, they've produced drawings of how they think the magma chamber in the caldera looks.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's funny because there's still an ongoing debate as to exactly how large the magma chamber is at Kilauea, and it's interesting because it depends on which discipline, specialist you ask. There's a way to infer the size of the chamber from looking at the ground deformation, the kind of the field of deformation on the surface. And then there's another way where you look at the chemistry of the lava that's being erupted. So those two methods can produce very different estimates of chamber volume. But yeah, we had an interesting phase of activity in 2018 when the lake drained. One of the issues is getting a direct measure of the pressure. So we infer the pressure based on how the ground is moving, but that can be sensitive to things like the volume of the chamber, but also the pressure. It's hard to differentiate, separate those two. We had an interesting phase in 2018 where there was a lava lake that was sitting over the chamber and it dropped, and we were able to directly measure the rate of its drop. And that lava lake kind of acted like because it was connected to the chamber, acts like a barometer, a liquid barometer. So they were able to get a very unusual and unique independent constraint on pressure, and they used that to estimate the volume. I don't remember the volume off the top of my head, but that was probably the best estimate we've had so far. I should say, though, another way to do it is with seismic imaging. So after the 2018 eruption, there was a big initiative to try to better image the reservoir there, the chamber. And we put out something like 2,000 seismic sensors around the volcano. It was a huge endeavor. And they brought in an instrument called the VibraSeis, which is an instrument they use in oil exploration to do seismic imaging of oil reservoirs. Mm. And that instrument, this VibraSeis, very precisely vibrates the ground. And then these seismic instruments can then measure that. And basically by looking at the way that the signals, change between the seismic instrument and the VibraSeis source, you can put that all together to try to get a better image of the chamber. So that was a huge endeavor, and they're processing the data as we speak.
Interesting. Yeah, no, they as you mentioned, they use it in oil exploration, and they've used it down at Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida to try and determine whether there are any sizable oil reservoirs worth tapping. Now, getting back to the current episodes that started back on December 23rd, they've varied in behavior. I get your daily reports on the volcano's behavior, and there might be some small fountains, 20 or 30 feet. The other day, I think there was one that reached 1,000 feet. Mm-hmm. Do the differing fountains in size and behavior, what do they tell you about the eruption that's going on, if anything?
I think that's definitely telling us something important. It's still a work in progress, but I think in the broad sense, it's probably telling us something about the evolution of that conduit that connects the reservoir to the surface. The first 3 or 4 episodes were, when you look at their trend, they were very kind of variable and disorganized. It started with fountaining, but it was very unpredictable, variable, and it would kind of sputter out. By the time you got to the 5th episode, that's when you started to see, and those earlier episodes, their duration was also highly variable. Some lasted a couple, or more than a week. One lasted more than a week, I think. But it was kind of behavior of these first 3 or 4 episodes was all over the place. But by the time you got to the 5th episode, then it started this pattern that was very regular of these very distinct fountains that would last for about 12 to 24 hours and then be separated, have a quiet interval of about a week. And that continued until, the most recent episode and may continue farther. So it seemed like that the system was kind of immature in those early phases, and then it really, matured into this very regular, repeatable pattern that we've seen for the last 10 episodes. I'm assuming that has to do something with the evolution of the conduit, kind of establishing itself, clearing itself, so that now it's maybe more efficiently open. But yeah, I would say it's still an open question, because we're still kind of collecting the data. That's what's fundamentally hard at an observatory like this that's so busy, is that you're kind of collecting the data, and then you have to find the time to actually analyze it. But the data collection can be so time consuming that you never feel like you have enough time to kind of think when you're running around and always in response mode. So
Sure.
Quiet periods here are actually quite nice for the science, in the sense that we can actually kind of chill out and then maybe start ruminating on these things.
Getting back to these fountaining events, it's spectacular. I've only been out to the national park once, and I've walked across I think it's the Kilauea Iki Trail, and I can't remember what year that erupted, but they've got this incredible photo of a towering fountain of lava there, and I also can't remember how big that was. But this past week you had at least one fountain that went over 1,000 feet. I mean, that must be just spectacular to watch. Awe-inspiring.
I would say, I've been at Hawaiian Volcano Observatory for 17 years, and this is among the most spectacular activity that I've seen in that time. So Kilauea Iki, was an eruption, a major eruption on Kilauea, happened in 1959, and it sent out flows, had 17 fountaining episodes, and yes, those were the highest recorded in Hawaii. I believe reaching something like 450 meters high.
Wow.
So that eruption is kind of like, if you study lava fountains, you're going to be looking at Kilauea Iki. It's just a kind of an iconic eruption for lava fountaining behavior. And the hike you did is basically goes across the crater floor, where lava from that fountaining filled in the crater up to a depth of about 100 meters. So it produced a kind of lava lake that then took decades to cool. What we see now with the recent episode, it's reminiscent of that eruption, of course, because we've now had 15 episodes, and they've been separated by, days like Kilauea Iki. But the eruption, the fountains in this current one haven't quite reached Kilauea Iki level. The episode 15 fountain that happened a couple of days ago reached about a little over 300 meters, but that's a serious lava fountain. I had never seen a lava fountain that large before. So before I'd maybe seen, I'm trying to think, it was under maybe about 100 meters. So, and when we go into the closed area to monitor, you can get, we approach, obviously we're very concerned about safety. No one here is cavalier, but if the wind direction is consistent, you can actually get closer to take very detailed observations of the fountaining behavior. So data that we collect 4K video that then we can compare to the seismic data and the seismic tremor, the infrasound, which is kind of a low frequency sound that's produced by the volcano, to then kind of compile that into to understand the process of this lava fountaining.
Yeah. Now, you were saying earlier that as the eruptive phase continues, I was going to say matures, but probably not a good word, matures, but as it continues, it kind of clears out that conduit, and maybe that's why you get these larger fountains of lava. So is it like one big throat coming up to the top of the caldera there, and it just is finding the soft spots in the crust that produce the fountains?
Yeah, the conduit is always, that's the key to understanding the eruption, but it's also often one of the most enigmatic parts of the volcano, because it's pretty small. These conduits normally are just a couple meters across, at basaltic volcanoes. So it's not something that's easily like imaged with seismic imaging or anything like that. They're relatively small, but they obviously have a big influence on the eruptive behavior. This conduit is running up along the side of the crater, so it may have found, a kind of an area of weakness along the kind of the wall, or that kind of collapsed structure or fault that's beneath the ground. The other interesting thing is that the conduit clearly splits at a shallow level into two vents. We have a north vent and a south vent. And one of the interesting aspects of this eruption is watching the different behavior of those two vents. Obviously, they must be joined at some shallow level because they do have some kind of sympathetic or maybe anti-correlated behavior. What you see is that, one of the patterns that you see is when, we've often seen dual fountaining, and that's another really interesting aspect of this eruption is even Kilauea, that was just one fountain. Normally, you just get one fountain at a time. This eruption has had two simultaneous fountains that are right next to each other. But what we've seen is that when one fountain, say the north fountain, abruptly drops, then we'll see the south fountain shoot up tens of meters or maybe even 100 meters within seconds, basically. And we've also seen spattering at a lower level at these vents that was very clearly anti-correlated. We'll also see a process called gas pistoning, which is where it's a cyclic process where the lava column kind of bubbles up and then collapses, and then bubbles up and then collapses. So gas pistoning is a process that people see on Kilauea that we've seen all the time. That's also kind of an enigmatic process, but I think actually some of the recent observations we've had over the last 10 years have produced a lot more insight into that the gas pistoning is kind of like building a foam, like a glass of beer, a foam that builds up and then collapses, and then it builds up and collapses. What we've seen is that gas pistoning, we've actually seen it simultaneously happening in the north vent and the south vent, but they happen at different rhythms, at different intervals, which is, I don't know, to me, I guess it's a testament to the fact that these the very shallowest conduits are kind of operating independently in a way, but they're ultimately joined at, some shallow level.
Does the fountaining activity or behavior indicate, possibly a larger eruption is coming or things are simmering down?
There's nothing to indicate that this is building up to a much larger event. The fountains ultimately represent pressure release in the magma chamber, and we can measure that very well with our ground tilt meters. So these tilt meters are they're one of the most useful ways of measuring the pressure buildup in the magma chamber, and they are exactly what they sound like. They're basically just fancy carpenter's levels, but it's basically a fluid column that has a bubble in it, and it has electronics on either end that measure the displacement of the bubble. So when the ground tilts, say, away from the chamber, that's an indicator that the chamber is pressurizing. And if the tilt meter tilts towards the chamber, then that's an indicator that the system is depressurizing. And these tilt meters are incredibly sensitive, so you can really get a good handle, a good handle on these pressure changes. So what we've seen is that each of these episodes is preceded by pressure buildup, and then when the fountaining episode happens, it immediately drops. So it produces this kind of sawtooth pattern in the tilt, with each drop representing a lava fountain. The overall trend is not showing a large or significant increase, let's say, to something bigger. So that's a sign that these episodes are relieving the pressure in the chamber efficiently, for now. Once they stop, then the pressure will build, and then it's a matter of watching and waiting to see how that pressure is released in a subsequent eruption. Now, when the eruptions happen at the summit, that's always good news because the lava is contained within the summit crater, so there's no threat to residential areas like in previous eruptions. And the viewing is wonderful for visitors, and it's great for science too. But our main concern, whenever we're seeing the system pressurize, is that magma could decide to intrude into one of the rift zones.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. The daily reports that come out frequently refer to either the East Rift Zone or the Southwest Rift Zone. What's the significance of those two zones that merits such attention to what's going on there?
Yeah, they're very important for hazard. So Kilauea and many or most Hawaiian volcanoes have these things called rift zones, and they are kind of long linear zones of structural weakness that magma kind of preferentially moves along. So if you think of at the summit, at the top of the shield, we have this big magma chamber. These rift zones are kind of like a seam that runs down one or two or more of the flanks of that shield. And those are routes, pathways that magma can often travel along to go down the flank of the volcano. And on the flank is where there are, on Kilauea, many residential subdivisions, particularly in the lower flank, what we call the lower East Rift Zone. Kilauea, I should say, has two rift zones, an East Rift Zone and a Southwest Rift Zone. The Southwest Rift Zone is largely uninhabited. It's in the national park. The East Rift Zone, about half of it, or much, I should say, the first part of it, the upper part of it is in the national park, but the lower part is getting into residential areas. And these are residential areas that have seen a lot of population growth in recent years. So in 2018, what we had is that magma traveled along the East Rift Zone into the lower East Rift Zone, where there are numerous subdivisions, and lava began erupting from the lower East Rift Zone right in the middle of Leilani Estates subdivision. So that was very unfortunate. It was a very fortunate location in terms of hazard because it destroyed hundreds of homes, and it was a major crisis for the island and that community.
Yeah. Any idea why you saw the intrusion into the East Rift Zone back in 2018 and you haven't seen it today in 2025?
Yeah, we're in a very different kind of era on Kilauea now. Before 2018, or during 2018, we had this long-lived eruption, the Pu'uo'o eruption, that had been happening for 35 years, and that was in the Middle East Rift Zone. So it was about, it was partway down the rift zone. It was mostly an uninhabited area, although that eruption went on for 35 years. It did actually cause quite a bit of destruction in the Kalapana area, destroyed 200 homes in 1990. And then subsequently it destroyed a handful of homes in 2008 and 2010 and 2011. And then one home in 2014 near Pahoa. But most of that activity was actually far away from, it was in the national park, far away from residential areas. Like I said, not all, because it did cause destruction, but most of it was relatively isolated. It had been going on for 35 years. It showed fluctuations in activity and pressure buildup and release. But in March of 2018, we started to see pressure building up at Pu'uo'o. We had seen this before, and what happened in basically April 30th of 2018 is that magma at Pu'uo'o broke through some kind of barrier in the rift zone and intruded farther down the rift zone, where we hadn't seen magma intrude since 1960. So once those earthquakes started going past Pu'uo'o into the lower East Rift Zone, that was an immediate red flag that something serious was going on, and there was hazard potential. So yeah, this magmatic dike intruded through the rift zone and then continued going until it reached the lower East Rift Zone and Leilani Estates, and it erupted for 4 months. So that eruption on the lower East Rift Zone was so large, it drained basically a cubic kilometer of magma from the summit magma chamber. It was so large that it triggered a collapse of the crater floor at the summit. So this is 40 kilometers upslope of the 2018 vents. It drained the magma chamber so much that it caused the caldera floor to collapse. And the floor dropped over 500 meters. created a much larger depression. Yeah. So then things were quiet for about a year after the 2018 activity stopped. But what we're in now is basically a phase of caldera refilling. And so that's been driving, the summit eruptions that we've had since 2020. We've had a handful of them. And what they've been doing is they've basically been refilling that collapse pit that formed in 2018. And this is Kilauea's classic cycle of activity of caldera collapse and refilling at the summit. And those collapses are normally associated with, some large eruption on the lower flank of the volcano. You can imagine poking a hole in the bottom of a bucket and watching it drain. These caldera collapses happen because basically, you have a large amount of magma that's evacuated from the summit chamber. And you can evacuate that magma much more efficiently when you have an eruption on the lower flank of the volcano than the upper flank. So we're now in this phase of caldera refilling. But at some point, when you refill, and this cycle has happened numerous times in geologic history. Even in the 1800s, this cycle happened a handful of times. When you refill that caldera up to a certain level, that pressure, it reaches some threshold where the pressure is sufficient where it can then return to pushing magma into the rift zones, kind of laterally. And I think we saw that kind of threshold reached earlier last year when we saw, first we had an eruption in the upper southwest rift zone, and then we had an eruption in the Middle East rift zone on Kilauea. And each of those eruptions, they were preceded by huge amounts of ground deformation and ground cracking. And it was showing that magma was was trying to push itself into the rift zone, and with great difficulty because it was breaking rock, huge numbers of earthquakes. Some of the park roads were cracked and are still cracked from all of this, forceful injection of magma into the rift zone. So it was saying that, okay, the pressure in the chamber has reached a critical point, and now magma has the potential to go into the rift zone. And so, we had 2 eruptions last year in the rift zones, and it's a sign that magma has that potential. So that's why, now we're taking a very close look at any signs that magma might return to, re-entering the rift zones.
Yeah. Now, right next door to Kilauea is Mauna Loa,
the world's largest active volcano.
Yeah, but there's no real connection between the eruptions at Kilauea and the eruptions at Mauna Loa, although in the past year we had simultaneous eruptions, I believe.
Yeah, so there's like we were talking about earlier, there's still a little bit of debate about that. They do know that they are independent at a shallow level. They do not share conduits at a shallow level. They have distinct magmatic plumbing systems. But ultimately, they do go down and are sourced from the same hotspot in the upper mantle. Now, that said, we just said that they had independent plumbing systems. They do have some correlation in their activity in the sense that they're neighbors and they press on each other. Their pressure does influence one another. So there is some indication that when one is more active, the other is less active, and vice versa. But on short time scales, it's really hard to say. There's no obvious link in terms of kind of short term fluctuations in activity.
Yeah, and there's been no signs that Mauna Loa is reacting at all to what Kilauea is doing.
No, Mauna Loa is relatively quiet right now. So it had an eruption in 2022, and it was on its northeast rift zone. Thankfully, that was in a part of the volcano that was not populated. Although that flow did threaten one of the major highways on the island, but thankfully the flow stalled a couple miles, a mile or so, I should say, before reaching that highway. Since then, we have been in this very subtle, gradual phase of repressurizing the magma chamber, so it is refilling, but it is at a very low rate. It's very slow, steady. The number of earthquakes has been low, so it's now relatively quiet. But of course, it will erupt again, and Mauna Loa is a serious hazard concern because mainly because of its, well, in part because of its southwest rift zone. There are some large subdivisions in the lower part of the southwest rift zone. The southwest rift zone cuts through one of these subdivisions. So whenever you have residential areas that are built on the rift zone, that obviously is a hazard concern because that reduces the amount of time you have for response.
Yeah. And then there's one other volcano, I believe, on the Big Island, Mauna Kea.
There's Mauna Kea that hasn't erupted in over 4,000 years. So yeah, it's that's been quiet. No signs of any earthquake activity. I should say, another volcano that has erupted in historic times is Hualalai. So that's just west of Mauna Loa. That's on the Kona side of the island. That last erupted in 1801. That's also a potential hazard concern because it's very close to the populated areas on the Kona side. It's a relatively small volcano, so those distances are pretty short, and the slopes are relatively steep there. So that translates into lava flows traveling faster. But thankfully, Hualalai has been very quiet in recent decades.
Yeah, interesting. The 2018 eruption of Kilauea that did all that damage, was that an unusual eruption?
It was unusual in the sense that it was the most destructive volcanic event in Hawaii in the past 200 years. It was not, in a geologic sense, it was not unusual because Kilauea has lots of eruptions on its rift zones. It has had eruptions in the lower east rift zone where this eruption happened in 1955, 1960, 1840, 1790. So it's part of its normal, geologic behavior. But the fact that there has been, obviously a lot of development on the lower east rift zone, and a very unfortunate placement of that vent right in the middle of the subdivision destroyed, like I said, 700 homes. And so that was, it was a lot of destruction, and it was a crisis for many of the families on the island.
Must be tough to get homeowners insurance if you're building on the side of a volcano.
Yeah, there's been some. I believe many of those people got insurance compensation, but it's not really my specialty. But there have been changes in the insurance policies following that event. So that's been, my understanding, is an additional challenge for residents here on the island.
Yeah, I bet. And now earlier you said that Kilauea Iki was just one fountain, I believe. And
it had something like 17 episodes. But from a single vent, more or less.
Yeah.
Well, the opening phase had numerous vents along the line, like typical Hawaiian fissure, but then it focused into one.
And Kilauea during this eruption has already had multiple fountains at the same time.
Yeah, it's now been focused on two vents, and they've each had their different styles of activity. The 300-meter high fountain that we observed the other day came from the south fountain, and in the recent episodes, that south vent has been producing the highest fountains.
And when that one's producing a fountain of 300 meters or 1,000 feet, what's the other fountain look like?
It's been variable. Sometimes it's been tens of meters high, and sometimes it just shuts off. There was, at least one time where I was on the rim watching it, and I could see the north fountain just very abruptly shut off, and then that's when the south fountain really shot up within moments to over 200 meters. This was episode 14.
Yeah.
Obviously influencing one another in some way, but I mean, those conduits must be joined at a very shallow level. So I did my grad school research on an island on a volcano called Stromboli in the Mediterranean in Italy. And that volcano has 3 vents, and it's had 3 vents for hundreds of years. That eruption has been having small fountains every 15 or 20 minutes for the last 2,000 years. So wow. It's a wonderful place to collect data. But there's been a lot of focus on trying to understand that shallow conduit. And it is known that at Stromboli, those 3 craters are connected at some shallow level, probably hundreds of meters depth, within hundreds of meters depth. Actually, yeah, could be tens of meters, hundreds of meters, but not very deep.
Now, as you said, you just went through episode 15 of the current eruption. Previously, you said, I think, Kilauea erupted for, was it 20 or 30 years continuously?
Yes, it had the Pu'o'o eruption, the one that we had talked about that kind of preceded and led up to the big 2018 event. That eruption had been going on for 35 years, more or less continuously. And then at that same time, we had a lava lake at the summit, which was active for 10 years. And, looking back at the historic record in the last 200 years, the summit lava lake in Halima'uma'u crater has had periods where it was active for basically 100 years. That was a phase when in late 1800s, when volcano tourism here started to really pick up, and Mark Twain came out, stayed at the Volcano House Hotel here on the crater rim and wrote about it. So that phase of continuous, 100-year lava lake activity was quite special. And that was the reason that Hawaiian Volcano Observatory got founded here, because, it was an opportunity to watch volcanic activity up close.
So any predictions on how long the current eruption could go? I mean, does Kilauea give any signals that, I've had it, I'm going to take a break, or, we're going to be going at this for a while?
Right now, we're seeing that the tremor has dropped. So that's a little unusual. It could show a sign that could indicate that the eruption is dying out, but I think it's too hard to say, because it could easily pick up again. 15 episodes is a lot. It's been obviously wonderful for viewing. I hope we get more episodes, because this eruption is safe. It's contained within the crater. It's not threatening populated areas. It's a really special opportunity for folks to be able to stand on the rim and watch a lava fountain. Like I said, lava fountains don't happen every day here. In the 17 years that I've been, and many of those lava fountains have been in remote areas that, the public doesn't have easy access to. So the fact that you can basically just, park your car and walk to the rim in 2 minutes and watch a 300-meter high lava fountain is pretty special.
That never gets boring, does it?
No.
That's Matthew Patrick. He's a research geologist at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, talking about the recent eruptions of Kilauea in Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park. Matt, thanks so much for taking the time to explain what's going on, and sounds like a wonderful opportunity to conduct your science.
Yeah, thanks so much for being able to chat today.
That's our show for this week. I hope you found it interesting, and hope you're lucky enough to sometime visit Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park to catch Kilauea in action. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.